The wind in Silver Creek had a voice, and it spoke of endings. It was a low, mournful sound that scraped along the cracked earth, lifting dust from the single street and whispering through the bones of dying corn in the fields beyond. Signs hanging from the fronts of the false-fronted buildings. The general store, the assayer's office, the saloon creaked on rusty hinges, their painted letters faded to ghosts. It was a town bleached by a relentless sun and starved by a sky that had forgotten how to weep. Every face held the same pinched look of endurance, the quiet desperation of folks living one bad harvest, one sick cow, one dry well away from ruin. Survival was the only currency that mattered here, and most everyone was poor. Inside the sweat-soaked, sour-smelling kitchen of the Silver Creek Saloon, Clara Duval was poorer than most. At 21, her hands were already old, chapped raw from lye soap and scalding water, the knuckles swollen, wisps of her dark blonde hair, the color of dried prairie grass, clung to her damp temples as she scrubbed a mountain of greasy plates. The heat from the wood stove was a physical presence, a thick, suffocating blanket in the already cramped space. Through the swinging door, she could hear the raucous sounds of the saloon, the tinny plink of the piano, the clink of glasses, the low rumble of men's voices punctuated by sharp bursts of laughter. To her, it was the sound of a world she served but could never join. Each plate she cleaned, each floor she scrubbed, was a coin tossed against an ever-rising tide of debt. It had been 6 months since her father, a good man with a kind heart and a terrible sense of luck, had misjudged the width of a washed-out gully. The wagon, laden with supplies he had bought on credit, had overturned, and that had been the end of him. It was also the end of the small homestead they had fought so hard to carve from the unyielding land. All that remained was his debt to Mr. Harlow, the saloon's owner, and an ailing mother whose cough seemed to grow deeper with every passing week. A dry, rattling sound that echoed the rustle of the dead corn husks outside their tiny, rented room. The swinging door flew open, letting in a wave of noise and stale cigar smoke. Mr. Harlow stood there, a short, stout man whose belly strained the buttons of his waistcoat. His face was perpetually flushed, and his small, dark eyes missed nothing. "Clara," he said, his voice slick with false congeniality. "A moment." She dried her hands on her apron, her heart giving a familiar, anxious flutter. She followed him into his small, cluttered office behind the bar. The room smelled of cheap whiskey and old paper. He did not offer her a seat, but went straight to his desk and shuffled through a ledger. "The account, my dear," he began, tapping a long, yellowed fingernail on a line of figures. "Your father's account. It is, shall we say, significantly past due." "I am working it off, Mr. Harlow," Clara said, her voice quiet but steady. She hated the pleading tone that always tried to creep into it. "I work every hour you give me. You take it from my wages." "Wages?" He gave a short, unpleasant laugh. "My dear girl, what you earn in a month barely covers the interest. You are scrubbing pans while the principal grows like a weed. I am a businessman, not a charity." A cold dread coiled in her stomach. "I will work harder. I can take on the mending. I can—" "No," he cut her off, his voice hardening. "I have been patient. Your mother's medicine, the room you rent, it all adds up. The debt stands at $200, a formidable sum." He paused, letting the weight of the number settle in the small, airless room. "I have an arrangement. A traveling company is passing through next week. They are in need of a seamstress, a laundress, a girl who is not afraid of hard work. They will purchase your contract. The debt will be cleared." Clara stared at him, the blood draining from her face. A traveling company. It could mean anything. A group of performers, a railroad crew, a band of traders. It meant being sold. It meant leaving Silver Creek, leaving her mother. The thought was a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. "No," she whispered. "You cannot." "I can and I will," Harlow said, his eyes like chips of flint. "The debt is an asset. Your labor is an asset. It is simple business." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Or you find me $200 by Friday?" $200. He might as well have asked for the moon. She had less than $1 to her name, saved for the bitter tonic her mother needed. Humiliation and fury warred within her, leaving her trembling and speechless. She was trapped, a fly caught in a spider's web, and the spider was smiling at her. She turned, her pride the only thing holding her upright, and walked out of the office, the swinging doors of the saloon's main room feeling like the entrance to a cage. The saloon was quiet, unnaturally so. The piano had stopped. The low murmur of conversation had died. All eyes were on a man standing by the bar, a man whose presence seemed to suck the very air and light from the room. It was Gabe Callahan. He was not a man you overlooked, tall and broad-shouldered. He was dressed in the practical, worn clothes of a rancher, but they sat on him with an authority that bespoke wealth. His dark hair was thick, touched with gray at the temples, and his face was a landscape of harsh lines carved by sun and sorrow. But it was his eyes that held the room captive. They were a pale, cold gray, like a winter sky, and they seemed to see everything and feel nothing. Rumors clung to Gabe Callahan like burrs to a saddle blanket. They said he had come to this territory a decade ago with nothing but a horse and a strong back, a simple cowboy with a hunger for land. They said he had worked and fought and bled for every acre of his sprawling ranch, the largest in the county. And they said that 5 years ago, the prairie had taken everything that mattered from him. His young wife, heavy with their first child, caught in a blizzard while riding home. They found her the next spring. They said Callahan had not been the same man since. The warmth had gone out of him, leaving something hard and cold and silent in its place. He was respected for his wealth, feared for his temper, and known for a heartlessness that was legendary in Silver Creek. He had been nursing a whiskey at the far end of the bar, and he had heard everything. His gaze fell on Harlow, who flinched as if struck. Then, his eyes moved to Clara. She stood frozen, the public silence more humiliating than Harlow's private threats. She felt stripped bare, her family's shame laid out for all to see. She lifted her chin, refusing to let him see her break. Callahan moved from the bar, his stride long and measured, the spurs on his boots casting the only sound in the dead quiet, a soft, metallic whisper. He stopped in front of Harlow's office door. "How much is the debt?" His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. Harlow, flustered, stammered. $200, Mr. Callahan. A business matter." Callahan reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a worn leather pouch. He untied the drawstring and emptied a cascade of gold and silver coins onto the dusty bar top. The sound was deafening in the silence. He counted out the amount with deliberate, methodical movements, his large, calloused fingers sorting the coins with an unsettling precision. He pushed the pile toward Harlow. "The debt is paid," Callahan stated. It was not a question. A collective sigh seemed to pass through the room. Clara's legs felt weak with a dizzying, disbelieving relief. She stared at the pile of money, a fortune that had just saved her. But her relief was short-lived. Callahan's cold gray eyes found hers again. "She will come with me," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. The whispers started then, a venomous hiss that spread through the room. Clara's heart, which had just begun to beat again, froze in her chest. "Come with you?" Harlow asked, his eyes wide. "She will work it off," Callahan said, his gaze never leaving Clara's face. "At my ranch, the debt is not forgiven. It is transferred. She will repay it to me in service." The final 2 words hung in the air, ugly and loaded with insinuation. A wave of heat washed over Clara's face, a flush of shame so intense it felt like a brand. He had not saved her. He had bought her, in front of the entire town. He had announced her price and claimed her as his property. The men at the tables stared, their expressions a mixture of shock, pity, and a crude, knowing curiosity. Her mother. The thought pierced through her paralysis. Her mother, waiting in their small, damp room, would hear of this. The humiliation would be unbearable. "No," Clara said, the word a ragged tear in the fabric of the silence. "I will not." Callahan's expression did not change. He simply looked at her as if she were a stubborn filly that needed breaking. "You have no choice," he said. "The debt is mine now. So is your labor. Get your things." He turned and walked out of the saloon, leaving a stunned, buzzing silence in his wake. Clara stood trembling, trapped between the leering eyes of the townsfolk and the unyielding command of the man who now owned her. Duty warred with a pride that was being systematically dismantled. But her mother was sick, and this man's money had paid for the medicine, for the roof over their heads. To refuse was to sentence her mother to an even worse fate. There was no choice at all. Her walk back to the small room she shared with her mother was the longest of her life. Every curtain seemed to twitch as she passed. Every shadow seemed to hold a whispering neighbor. When she opened the door, her mother was sitting up in bed, a thin, worn shawl around her shoulders. Mary Duval had been a beautiful woman, but grief and illness had worn her down, leaving a fragile, bird-like creature with eyes that were too large for her pale face. She already knew. Bad news traveled faster than the wind in Silver Creek. "Clara?" she whispered, her voice frail. Clara could not bring herself to speak. She simply began to pack her few belongings into a small, cloth satchel, a spare dress, a brush, the worn book of poems her father had given her. "You must not go with that man," her mother pleaded, tears welling in her eyes. "They say he is cruel, that his heart is a stone." "His money paid the debt, Mama," Clara said, her voice choked. "His money will keep you here, with a roof and your medicine. I have to go." The shame in the room was a third person, heavy and suffocating. A Callahan had bought a Duval. It was a humiliation that would stain their name for generations. Mary Duval began to weep, quiet, racking sobs of a woman who had lost everything and was now losing her daughter. Clara went to the bed and took her mother's thin, trembling hand. "I will be strong," she promised, her own tears blurring the sight of her mother's face. "I will work hard, and I will come back. I promise you." Her mother clung to her hand, her gaze searching Clara's face as if to memorize it. "Come back when the sun feels warm again," she whispered, her voice catching. "Promise me you will come back when you feel the warmth of the sun on your face again." It was a strange, poetic plea from a woman broken by a hard life, a plea for a hope neither of them could truly feel. "I promise, Mama." An hour later, Clara stood beside Gabe Callahan's buckboard wagon. He loaded her small satchel in the back without a word, then moved to help her up onto the seat. She flinched from his touch, climbing up on her own, her movements stiff with resentment. The wagon ride to the Callahan ranch was a study in tense, suffocating silence. The wheels groaned over the dusty, rutted track, and the sun beat down with a merciless intensity. They passed the last struggling farms on the edge of town and entered the vast, open plains that belonged to Callahan. The land stretched on for miles in every direction, a rolling sea of brown grass under an endless blue sky. It was beautiful in its own stark, lonely way, but to Clara, it felt like an extension of the man beside her, immense, empty, and intimidating. He smelled of leather, dust, and something else, something clean and cold, like winter air. He sat straight, holding the reins with a practiced ease, his profile sharp and unyielding against the horizon. After nearly an hour of silence, broken only by the creak of the wagon and the plodding of the horses, he spoke. "The work will be hard," he said, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "But you will have a decent room, and you will be fed." Clara said nothing, staring straight ahead, her hands clenched into fists in her lap. His attempt at conversation felt like an insult, a landlord explaining the terms of a lease to a tenant who had no choice but to sign. He tried again, a slight, almost imperceptible frustration entering his tone. "Mrs. Avery is the housekeeper. She will show you what needs doing." She gave a short, sharp nod, refusing to look at him. Her bitterness was a shield, hard and polished. To speak to him, to engage in any kind of civility, felt like a surrender. He had taken her freedom and humiliated her family. He would not have her voice as well. He fell silent after that, a muscle working in his jaw. The rest of the journey passed in that same strained quiet, the distance between them on the narrow wagon seat feeling as vast and empty as the prairie itself. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, the ranch came into view. It sat in a shallow valley, a collection of buildings that seemed both impressive and neglected. The main house was a large, two-story structure made of timber and stone, bigger than any 3 buildings in Silver Creek combined. There were long, low barns, a blacksmith's forge, and a web of corrals, but the fences that stretched out from the main settlement were in disrepair, their posts leaning like tired old men. Paint was peeling from the barn doors, and a profound stillness hung over the place, a silence that felt not peaceful, but empty. Wealth was here, but warmth was not. A few ranch hands stopped their work to watch the wagon approach, their faces hard, their eyes lingering on Clara with a bold, assessing curiosity. She felt their gazes like insects crawling on her skin and pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Callahan brought the wagon to a halt in front of the main house and climbed down. He said nothing, simply waiting for her, swallowing her pride. She accepted his offered hand, her fingers barely brushing his before she pulled away. His hand was rough and calloused, but there was a startling warmth in it that she refused to acknowledge. He led her into the house. The inside was as contradictory as the outside. Fine. Dark wood floors were covered in a thin layer of dust. A grand stone fireplace dominated one wall, but it was cold and black. The furniture was heavy and expensive, but it seemed placed without thought or care, like artifacts in a museum. It was the house of a man who had forgotten how to live in it. An older woman with a stern face and iron-gray hair pulled into a tight bun met them in the hall. This was Mrs. Avery. Her eyes, small and critical, swept over Clara, taking in her worn dress and cheap satchel. "This is Clara Duval," Callahan said. "She will be working here. Find her a room. Show her the kitchen." His tone was that of a man giving an order about a new piece of livestock. Without another word, he turned and walked down the hall to a room that was clearly his office, shutting the door firmly behind him. "Mrs." Avery's lips thinned. "Follow me," she said, her voice as starched as her apron. She led Clara up a wide staircase to the second floor and down a long, silent hallway. She opened a door at the very end. The room was small and simple, but it was clean. It held a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a small wooden dresser, and a washstand with a pitcher and bowl. A single window looked out over the vast, empty plains. It was 100 times better than the room she had left, but it felt like a prison cell. "You will start at dawn," the housekeeper said from the doorway. "The kitchen. Be on time. The master does not tolerate laziness." She turned and left, pulling the door closed with a soft, final click. Clara stood in the middle of the room, her small bag clutched in her hand. The silence of the house pressed in on her. It was a heavy, lonely silence, filled with the ghosts of what might have been. She walked to the window and looked out at the darkening land. The sun had disappeared, leaving behind a bruised purple sky pricked with the first cold stars. She slowly unpacked her meager belongings, placing her father's book of poems on the small nightstand. She sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress soft beneath her. Yet it offered no comfort. All her life, She had belonged somewhere, to a family, to a home, however humble. First the homestead, then the small room in town with her mother. Now, she was a debt, a piece of property in a stranger's house. Later, lying awake in the unfamiliar bed, she listened to the sounds of the night. The wind moaned around the corners of the house, a desolate sound that matched the ache in her soul. And from far out on the plains came the high, lonely cry of coyotes, a sound of wildness and sorrow. It was the only voice that seemed to understand. I belong nowhere anymore, she thought, as a single tear escaped and traced a cold path down her temple into her hair. I belong nowhere at all. The days at the Callahan Ranch bled into one another, each marked by the rising and setting of a sun she had once loved and now saw only as a taskmaster. Clara's life became a rhythm of hard, repetitive chores that left her body aching and her mind numb. She was up before the first hint of dawn, the air in the house still and cold. Her first task was the milking, her cheek pressed against the cow's warm flank in the dim, lantern-lit barn. The sharp, sweet smell of hay and milk filling her senses. Her fingers, stiff with cold, would ache as she worked. But it was a simple, honest task, and for a few minutes each morning, she could almost forget where she was. The rest of the day was a blur of misses, Avery's sharp commands. Floors were to be scrubbed until the wood gleamed, laundry boiled in a great copper pot over an outdoor fire, bread kneaded until her shoulders screamed in protest. The housekeeper watched her with the vigilant eyes of a hawk, missing no speck of dust, no half-done chore. She was a woman who seemed to find a grim satisfaction in the endless war against dirt and disorder. "The master expects things just so," she would say, her lips a thin, disapproving line. "He does not have a tolerance for idleness or complaint." On another occasion, as Clara struggled to lift a heavy bucket of water, the older woman had paused, her hands on her hips. "You are here to work, girl. Nothing more. Do not trouble the master. Do not speak to him unless spoken to. A quiet worker is a good worker. Remember your place." Clara remembered her place with every waking breath. It was in the rising steam of the kitchen, in the weight of a water bucket, in the silent, solitary meals she ate at a small wooden table after Callahan and Mrs. Avery had finished. She saw Gabe Callahan only in passing glimpses. He would ride out at dawn with his men, a tall, commanding figure on a powerful black horse, and return at dusk, his face layered with dust and fatigue. Sometimes she would see him on the porch in the evening, staring out at the vast darkness of his land, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He never spoke to her, and his gray eyes, when they happened to fall on her, were as distant and unreadable as the horizon. The house was his kingdom, and she was just another part of its silent, functional machinery. Gabe watched her more than she knew. From the window of his office, a room filled with ledgers, maps of his land, and the lingering scent of old leather and tobacco, he saw her. He saw the stubborn set of her jaw as she hauled water from the well. He saw the straightness of her back as she walked across the yard, ignoring the curious, sometimes insolent, stares of his men. There was a fierceness in her that he recognized. It was the same raw, defiant pride that had burned in his own belly when he was a boy with nothing to his name but a pair of worn-out boots and a desperate hunger to make something of himself. She did not bow her head, not to Mrs. Avery's constant criticism, not to the back-breaking labor, not to the crushing weight of her circumstance. He had seen women break under far less. They wept, or they hardened into bitterness, or they learned a false, simpering sort of obedience. Clara Duval did none of these things. She simply endured, her silence a wall, her pride an armor. He had meant to save her from a worse fate, a thought that offered him a sliver of justification for his cold, public transaction. But seeing her here, a captive sparrow in his gilded cage, stirred a disquiet in him he had not felt in years. He told himself it was responsibility, the duty of an owner to his property, but deep down, in a place he kept locked and barred since his wife's death. He knew it was something more complicated, something that pricked at his conscience like a shard of glass. The incident happened on a bright, windswept afternoon. Clara was hanging sheets on the line behind the house, the white fabric billowing and snapping in the wind like a ship's sails. Two ranch hands, Jed and a younger man named Billy, were repairing a corral fence nearby. Jed was a coarse man with a cruel streak, his face permanently tanned to the color of saddle leather. "That is a lot of work for a girl," Billy commented, his voice loud enough to carry on the wind. Jed spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "She is earning her keep, boy. The rancher's bought girl. Heard he paid old Harlow a fortune for her." Billy snickered. "Wonder what kind of services she is paying him back with when the sun goes down." The word struck Clara with the force of a physical slap. The rancher's bought girl. It was the ugly, unspoken truth of her existence here, now given voice. It was what the whole town whispered, what these men believed, what she saw in their eyes every time they looked at her. A hot, sickening wave of shame washed over her. The clothespin slipped from her numb fingers, and a clean white sheet fell into the dust. She stared at it, the brown stain a mark of her own sullied reputation. She could not breathe. She could not stay here, under their leering, speculative gazes. Without thinking, she turned and ran, not toward the house, which felt like the source of her imprisonment, but away from it, out toward the open fields. She ran until her lungs burned and her side ached, until the house and the barns were small, distant shapes. She finally collapsed in the tall, dry grass, the harsh stalk scratching at her arms, and the tears she had held back for weeks finally came, hot and furious. She wept for her lost father, for her sick mother, for the life that had been stolen from her. She cried until she was empty, her sobs turning into ragged, hiccuping gasps. She did not hear him approach. The first she knew of his presence was a shadow falling over her. She looked up, startled, her tear-streaked face blotchy and swollen. Gabe Callahan stood there, his large frame blocking out the sun. His expression was unreadable, his gray eyes holding a strange, unidentifiable emotion. He must have seen her run. He said nothing for a long moment. He simply looked down at her, a crumpled figure of misery in his field. Then, with a slow, almost hesitant movement, he reached into his coat and pulled out a clean, folded handkerchief. He held it out to her. Clara stared at the white square of fabric in his calloused hand. It was an offer of comfort, a small, human gesture. And it came from the man who was the architect of her pain. Her pride, raw and wounded, surged back to life. She would not take his pity. "I do not need your help," she choked out, turning her face away from him. He held it there for another moment, then slowly withdrew his hand, his jaw tightening. "The men," he said, his voice a low rumble. "If they bothered you, you tell me their names." "And what?" she shot back, her voice dripping with scorn. "Will you beat them for insulting your property? I do not need you to fight my battles. Mr. Callahan." A flicker of something, anger, or perhaps frustration, crossed his face. He looked as though he wanted to say more, but the words would not form. He was a man of action and commands, not of comfort or soft words. He stood there, awkward and silent, the vast prairie stretching out around them. The gentleness of his initial gesture unsettled her more than any command could have. It was a crack in the granite facade, a glimpse of a man she did not understand, and it was deeply confusing. Finally, he turned without another word and strode back toward the ranch house, his back ramrod straight. Clara remained in the field until the sun began to sink, her tears dry, her heart a tangled knot of humiliation, anger, and a bewildering new uncertainty. That night, the house was quieter than usual. A deep, aching loneliness settled over Clara. She felt adrift, unmoored from everything she had ever known. After she had cleaned the last of the supper dishes, she found herself wandering into the parlor. It was a room Mrs. Avery kept perpetually clean but unused, a museum of a life that had ended 5 years ago. Dust motes danced in the moonlight slanting through the tall windows. In the center of the room stood a piano, its dark wood polished to a dull sheen. A fine layer of dust covered the keys. On impulse, Clara sat on the bench. Her mother had taught her to play a few simple tunes on an old, out-of-tune piano in their church. Hesitantly, she lifted the lid and touched a key. The note was slightly flat, but it rang with a soft, melancholic beauty in the silent house. She began to play, her fingers moving slowly at first, then with more confidence. It was a simple folk melody, a sad, sweet tune about a lost love. The music filled the empty room, a small, fragile sound of life in a house that felt dead. It was a comfort, a momentary escape. She closed her eyes, letting the music carry her back to a time when her life was her own. In his office down the hall, Gabe heard the first hesitant notes. He froze, the pen in his hand stilling over his ledger. That piano. No one had touched that piano since Elizabeth. He had bought it for her as a wedding gift, and she had filled this house with music, with life. He rose from his chair, drawn by a force he could not resist. He moved silently down the hall and stopped in the shadows of the parlor doorway. He saw her there, her back to him, her head bent over the keys, bathed in a pool of pale moonlight. The melody she played was not one Elizabeth had known, but it was just as haunting. It was a song of sorrow and longing, and it pierced through the thick scar tissue around his heart. Memories flooded him, sharp and painful. Elizabeth laughing as her fingers danced over these same keys, the way the sunlight would catch in her hair, the swell of her belly with the child they would never know. A lump formed in his throat, thick and suffocating. His eyes burned with tears he had refused to shed for years. He could not breathe, before the sob could escape, before she could turn and see the ghost that haunted him. He retreated, pulling back into the shadows and returning to his office. He shut the door and leaned against it, pressing the heels of his hands against his eyes as the music continued to drift, faint and heartbreaking, down the hall. Something shifted between them after that night. The invisible wall remained, but small cracks began to appear. Gabe started speaking to her directly, his voice still gruff, but the cold, dismissive edge was gone. One morning, he found her staring at the horses in the main corral. "Do you know how to ride?" he asked, coming to stand beside her at the fence. She shook her head. "My father had a mule, not a horse." The next afternoon, he had one of the hands saddle a gentle, older mare. He led Clara to a small training paddock. "Her name is Daisy," he said. "She will not give you any trouble." He showed her how to mount, his large hand briefly resting on her back to steady her. The touch was impersonal, practical, yet it sent a jolt through her. For an hour, he led the horse around the paddock, talking to her in a low, patient voice, explaining how to hold the reins, how to shift her weight. It was the most they had ever spoken. For that hour, she felt a flicker of freedom, the wind in her hair, the powerful animal beneath her, a connection to the wildness of the land she was beginning to know. He began to ask for her opinion on small matters. He found her in the garden one day, tending the small patch of herbs Mrs. Avery neglected. "The corn in the south field is looking yellow," he said, more to himself than to her. "Not enough rain. The soil is too sandy there," Clara heard herself say. "It does not hold the water. My father always said you had to mix in river mulch for sandy soil." Gabe looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He said nothing, but a week later, she saw 2 of his men driving a wagon back from the creek, laden with dark, rich earth for the south field. A small, tentative trust began to grow, as fragile as a spring seedling. But the truce was delicate, easily broken. He grew fiercely protective of her. When he saw Jed watching her cross the yard one afternoon with a look of crude appraisal, Gabe's face darkened with a quiet fury. He confronted the man later, his voice a low, lethal threat that left Jed pale and shaken. The next day, Gabe gave Clara a new set of chores, ones that would keep her inside the house or in the walled garden, away from the eyes of the ranch hands. Clara, realizing what he had done, was incensed. She found him in the barn, checking a saddle. "Why have you changed my work?" she demanded, her hands on her hips. He did not look up. "Mrs. Avery needs more help in the house." "That is a lie," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "You did it to keep me away from your men. You think I cannot take care of myself?" He finally looked at her, his gray eyes flashing. "I am trying to protect you." "Protect me?" she cried, her frustration boiling over. "Or protect your investment. I am not a porcelain doll. Mr. Callahan, I am not some fragile thing that will shatter. Being treated like a prisoner is not protection. It is just another kind of cage." "This is my ranch," he bit out, his own temper rising. "You will do as I say. I will not have you harassed by my men." "Then tell them I am a worker, not a possession," she retorted. "Tell them I am here to repay a debt, and that is all." Their angry words echoed in the cavernous barn. They stood facing each other, breathing heavily, the air thick with resentment and misunderstanding. He saw it as care, she saw it as control. The chasm between them seemed wider than ever. The sky had been darkening all afternoon, the clouds gathering on the horizon in bruised shades of purple and gray. As their argument raged, the wind began to howl, and the first fat drops of rain splattered against the barn roof. Neither of them noticed until a deafening clap of thunder shook the very foundations of the building. Clara gasped, her anger momentarily forgotten. "The chickens," she whispered. "I left the coop door open." The chickens were her responsibility, one of the few she had claimed as her own. She had a soft spot for the foolish, clucking birds. Without a second thought, she ran out of the barn into the sudden, torrential downpour. The rain was a solid sheet of cold water, plastering her thin dress to her body in seconds. The wind tore at her, nearly knocking her off her feet. "Clara, get back here!" Gabe yelled, but his voice was swallowed by the storm. He cursed, then ran after her. She reached the small chicken coop, her hair whipping across her face, blinding her. She fought to close the door against the wind, her hands numb with cold. She was soaked to the bone, shivering violently, when a powerful presence loomed beside her. Gabe slammed the door shut and latched it. "Are you a fool?" he roared over the wind, his hands gripping her shoulders. But then he saw her face, pale and streaked with rain, her lips blue with cold. Her whole body was shaking uncontrollably. The anger in his eyes vanished, replaced by a raw, overwhelming concern. He did not hesitate. He shrugged off his heavy canvas coat and wrapped it around her small, trembling form. It was huge on her, warm from his body, and smelled of rain and leather. Before she could protest, he swept her up into his arms. She was surprisingly light. She gave a small cry of surprise, but was too cold and shocked to struggle. He carried her not toward the main house, but toward a small, dark shape she had only ever seen from a distance. An old line cabin at the edge of the trees, a plume of smoke rising from its stone chimney. He kicked the door open and carried her inside. A fire was already blazing in a large stone fireplace, casting a warm, flickering glow over a simple, masculine room. There was a bed, a table, and a few chairs. This was his private refuge. He set her down on the hearth rug in front of the fire, her teeth chattering. The thunder roared again, so close it felt as if the sky were being ripped apart. He knelt before her, his expression grim. Her wet dress was useless. Without a word, he grabbed a thick wool blanket from the bed and held it up. "Get out of those wet things," he commanded, his voice rough with an emotion she could not name. He turned his back to give her privacy. Her fingers were so cold she could barely manage the buttons on her dress. Shaking, she let the wet garment pool at her feet and quickly wrapped the warm, dry blanket around herself. "Done," she whispered. He turned back. Their eyes met in the flickering firelight. The storm raged outside, a wild, elemental fury. But inside the small cabin, a different kind of storm was brewing. The anger and the arguments were gone, stripped away by the raw power of the moment. All that was left was a man and a woman, the sound of the roaring thunder, the crackling fire, and the loud, frantic beating of their own hearts. Neither of them spoke. The air hummed with a restrained, aching emotion, a silent confession of a truth too powerful and too dangerous to name. The fragile peace that had settled in the small cabin during the storm did not last. It evaporated like morning mist under the harsh light of a new day. In the weeks that followed, a tense quiet resumed, but something had irrevocably changed. The space between Clara and Gabe was no longer empty. It was charged with the unspoken memory of that night, of thunder and firelight and a shared, desperate vulnerability. It was this new, fragile awareness that made her next trip into Silver Creek so jarring. Gabe had insisted she take the mare, Daisy, whenever she needed supplies for the kitchen, a small but significant allowance of freedom, riding into town, with the sun on her face and the steady rhythm of the horse beneath her. Clara felt a flicker of something almost like contentment, but the moment she dismounted in front of the general store, she felt the change. The whispers followed her like a cloud of biting flies. They started the moment she stepped onto the boardwalk. Women who had once offered a polite, if distant, nod now turned their backs, their faces pinched with disapproval. Men who had previously ignored her now watched her with a new, speculative gleam in their eyes. At first, she thought she was imagining it. But then, as she stood at the counter waiting for the storekeeper to weigh out a bag of flour, she heard it clearly from two women lingering by a barrel of pickles. "That is the one," a woman in a gray bonnet whispered, her voice a sharp, sibilant hiss. "Callahan's girl. Keeps her out on that ranch like a queen. I hear," the other replied, her voice thick with righteous indignation. "Bought and paid for. It is a disgrace." The words were like stones, striking her one by one. Callahan's girl, bought and paid for. The heat of shame rose in her cheeks, so intense it felt as if the whole town could see it. She paid for her goods with trembling hands, scooped up her packages, and fled the store. The women's quiet, smug laughter following her out the door. The short ride back to the ranch was a torment, every clop of Daisy's hooves on the road echoing the ugly words in her mind. She had been a Duval, a name that, while not wealthy, had always been respectable. Now, she was a scandal, a piece of town gossip, a woman of low character. Gabe was in the corral, speaking to his foreman. When she rode in, he took one look at her pale, stricken face and the way she refused to meet his eyes, and his own expression hardened. He did not say a word to her, but after she had gone into the house, he questioned his foreman, a grizzled, loyal man named Silas. The story came out, pieced together from what Silas had heard on his own last trip to town. The whispers had started small, but they had been fed and nurtured, Gabe suspected, by one man in particular, a man who held a grudge, a man who saw profit in the misfortune of others. A cold, quiet rage began to build in Gabe. It was a feeling he knew well, an old companion from the days when all he had was his fists and his pride. He strode to the stables, saddled his black stallion with swift, economical movements, and rode out, his destination clear. He did not ride like a man in a hurry. He rode like a man on his way to an execution, his back straight, his face a mask of stone. He entered the Silver Creek saloon just as he had before, and just as before. A hush fell over the room. Harlow was behind the bar, polishing a glass. He looked up. and the color drained from his face when he saw Gabe Callahan standing in the doorway like an avenging ghost. "Callahan," he stammered, placing the glass down with a nervous click. "What can I get for you?" Gabe walked to the bar, his spurs ringing with a terrible finality on the wooden floor. He leaned forward, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You have been running your mouth. Harlow, you have been talking about the girl." "I do not know what you mean," Harlow said, his eyes shifting nervously. "I have not said a thing." "Liar," Gabe breathed. He reached across the bar with stunning speed and grabbed a fistful of Harlow's starched shirt, dragging him halfway over the polished wood. Bottles rattled. Men scrambled back from their tables. "You took my money for her debt, and then you sold her name for a bit of cheap gossip. You turned a private matter into a public spectacle." "It was just talk," Harlow wheezed, his face turning a blotchy red. "Town talk. I did not mean any harm." "Harm has been done," Gabe said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "And now it will be answered for—" He hauled the saloon owner over the bar as if he weighed nothing and dragged him toward the swinging doors. Harlow scrabbled for purchase, his feet kicking uselessly. Gabe shoved him through the doors and out into the dusty street. The afternoon sun was bright, and people stopped to stare as Gabe threw the sputtering man into the dirt. "You will tell everyone you lied," Gabe commanded, standing over him. Harlow, emboldened by the audience, found a sliver of courage. "I told the truth," he spat, wiping a trickle of blood from his lip. "You bought her! Everyone knows what that means. She is your—" He never finished the word. Gabe's fist connected with his jaw in a sickening crack of bone on bone. Harlow crumpled to the ground. Gabe hauled him up by his collar and hit him again. He was not fighting. He was delivering a punishment, methodical and brutal. He was silencing the whispers with a violence that was far louder than any rumor. When he was done, he let the man fall. Harlow lay in the dust, moaning, his face a bloody mess. Gabe stood over him, breathing heavily, his knuckles raw. He looked up, his cold gray eyes sweeping over the silent, horrified faces of the townsfolk who had gathered to watch. His gaze was a challenge, a warning. Then he turned, walked back to his horse, and rode out of town without a backward glance, leaving a profound and terrified silence in his wake. The act that was meant to protect Clara instead forged the final links of her shame. The story of the beating traveled back to the ranch before Gabe did. When he finally walked into the house that evening, his face grim, a dark bruise blooming on his knuckles. She was waiting for him in the main hall. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a chaotic mixture of emotions. There was gratitude in her, a fierce, primal appreciation for being defended, but it was drowned in a sea of rage and humiliation. "He was spreading lies," Gabe said, his voice flat. He walked past her toward his office. "Lies?" she cried, following him. "He told the truth. You bought my debt. You brought me here. That is the truth of it. And now you have proven him right. You have proven all of them right." He stopped at his office door and turned to face her. "What was I supposed to do? Let them tear you apart with their vicious tongues?" "You did not make it better. You made it worse," her voice cracked. "Now they do not just whisper. Now they know. They saw you, the cruel, powerful rancher beating a man in the street over his kept woman. You did not defend my honor. You claimed your property. You stood in the middle of town and announced to the world that I belonged to you." She was shaking now, tears of pure fury and helplessness streaming down her face. "You do not own me. You do not own my life." He stared at her, and for the first time the stone facade of his face seemed to crumble, a look of raw frustration, of deep, aching helplessness, crossed his features. "Then what was I to do?" he asked, his voice rough with an unfamiliar agony. "I do not know how else to show that I care." The confession hung between them, raw and shocking. It was the most vulnerable thing he had ever said to her. It was an admission of a man so broken by grief, so walled off from the world, that he no longer knew the language of tenderness. He only knew how to use his strength, his money, his fists. The anger in Clara faltered, confused by this glimpse into the barren landscape of his heart. But her own pain was too great. "Care?" she repeated, her voice laced with a new kind of despair. "You call this caring?" She gestured wildly, encompassing the house, the ranch, her entire situation. The argument had moved beyond reason, into the realm of pure, raw emotion. He followed her as she backed away, toward the back of the house and out into the cool night air, the argument continuing in harsh, whispered bursts until they found themselves in the vast, cathedral-like silence of the main barn. A single lantern cast long, dancing shadows across the hay-strewn floor. The air was thick with the scent of horses and dry alfalfa. "Here, away from the house," their voices rose again, echoing in the rafters. "You treat me like an object, a thing to be moved from one place to another, to be protected and hidden away," she accused, her chest heaving. "I had a life. I had a name. You have taken everything from me." "I gave you a roof over your head. I saved you from being sold to God knows who," he countered, his own control finally snapping. "Is this life so much worse?" "Yes," she screamed, the word torn from her throat. "Because then I would only be a stranger's servant. Here, I am a constant reminder of my family's shame, living in the house of the man who owns it." The injustice of it all, the powerlessness, the town's scorn, his violent, misguided protection, it all coalesced into a single, unbearable point of pressure inside her. An emotion she did not even think about. Her hand flew up and she slapped him across the face. The sound was sharp and loud, a gunshot in the silent barn. The red mark of her hand bloomed instantly on his cheek. He did not flinch, but his eyes widened in shock. She raised her other hand to strike him again, to beat against the unmovable wall of her fate. But this time, he was ready. His hand shot out and caught her wrist, his grip like steel. He held her there, his fingers wrapped around her slender bones, his chest rising and falling rapidly. They stood frozen, inches apart, bound by his grip. The fury in her eyes met the shock in his. The air crackled with a tension that was no longer just anger. It was something more primal, more dangerous. They were both trembling. The argument was over, burned out, leaving only the raw, undeniable force that had been simmering between them for months. His grip on her wrist loosened, his thumb stroking absently over her racing pulse. He looked down at her tear-stained face, her defiant, frightened eyes. Her lips parted as she gasped for breath. The anger in him died, replaced by a wave of desperate, aching tenderness. He let go of her wrist, and his other hand came up to gently cup her face, his thumb brushing away a tear from her cheek. A sob broke from her lips. The tension gave way. She swayed toward him, and his arms went around her, pulling her into a wordless, fragile embrace. She collapsed against his chest, her hands clutching his shirt. It was not an embrace of passion, but of desperation. It was the collision of two profound solitudes, a shared, silent acknowledgement of the pain that defined them both. He held her tightly, his face buried in her hair, breathing in her scent as if it were air itself. For a moment, there was nothing but the shelter of his arms, but then the reality of what she was doing, of who she was holding, crashed down on her. This was her master, the man who had bought her. Horrified by her own weakness, by the treacherous comfort she found in his arms, she stiffened and pushed away from him with all her strength. She stumbled back, her eyes wide with a new kind of fear. Without a word, she turned and fled the barn, running into the darkness as if the hounds of hell were at her heels. Gabe stood alone in the lantern light, his arms empty, the place where she had been a sudden, aching cold. He raised a trembling hand to his cheek, where the sting of her slap still lingered, a phantom touch of fire and desperation. The days that followed were filled with a heavy, suffocating silence. A line had been crossed in the barn. and both of them, shaken and afraid, retreated behind their walls. Gabe became a phantom in the house. He was gone before she rose and returned long after she had gone to her room, leaving only the faint scent of whiskey and the sound of his office door closing to mark his presence. He threw himself into his work, driving himself and his men with a relentless energy, seeking exhaustion as an escape from the turmoil within him. Clara felt his absence like a physical presence. The vast, empty house seemed even larger, the silence more profound. She was lonely, a deep, gnawing loneliness that was worse than anything she had felt before, because now it was tinged with the memory of his warmth, the phantom feeling of his arms around her, a memory that both shamed and haunted her. She was torn between her resentment of him and a new, treacherous longing for the man she had glimpsed in moments of crisis. One morning, just after dawn, she was in the garden when she saw him. He was not riding out with his men. Instead, he was walking slowly up the low, wind-swept hill behind the house. It was a place she had only ever seen from a distance, a solitary rise of land crowned with two simple wooden crosses, stark against the morning sky. Curiosity, and something more, compelled her to follow at a distance. She kept to the line of sparse trees, moving quietly until she could see him clearly. He was kneeling in the long grass in front of one of the graves. His broad back was to her, his head bowed. For a long time, he did not move. The wind whipped his hair and tugged at his coat. Then, she saw his shoulders begin to shake. A sound, ragged and raw, was torn from him, carried away by the wind. It was the sound of a heart breaking. He slumped forward, bracing his hands on the earth as if he could not hold up the weight of his own sorrow. "Elizabeth," she heard him whisper, the name a ragged prayer. "Forgive me. I am so sorry." Clara froze, her hand flying to her mouth. She felt like an intruder, a witness to a grief so profound and private, it was sacred. She was seeing the truth of him, the source of the coldness and the cruelty. It was not a void, it was a wound that had never healed. His heart was not made of stone. It was shattered, and he had spent 5 years trying to hold the pieces together. In that moment, watching the powerful Gabe Callahan break down at his wife's grave, she understood that his loneliness was as deep, if not deeper, than her own. Silently, she backed away, leaving him to his ghosts. Life settled into a new, somber routine. The silence between them was no longer angry, but freighted with a sad, unspoken understanding. 2 weeks after the incident at the grave, a rider came from town. He carried a letter for her. Clara took it with a sense of foreboding, recognizing the spidery handwriting of Dr. Adams. She sat on the top step of the porch, the wood warm beneath her, and broke the seal. The words were kind but direct. Her mother had passed in her sleep 2 nights prior. Her heart, weakened by her long illness, had simply given out. It had been peaceful. The world went silent. The letter fell from her numb fingers and fluttered to the ground. The sun still shone, the wind still rustled the leaves, but her own personal world had ended. A low, animal sound of pain escaped her throat. She wrapped her arms around herself, rocking back and forth, as the grief she had held at bay for so long washed over her in a black, suffocating wave. She did not know how long she sat there, lost in a sea of pain, before she became aware of a presence beside her. Gabe was standing there. He must have seen the rider. He looked at her crumpled form, then down at the letter in the dust. He did not speak. There were no words for this. In his silence, she felt not pity, but a deep, resonant understanding. He knew this kind of loss. He knew this emptiness. He went to the stables without a word. A few minutes later, he returned, leading his stallion and the gentle mare, Daisy, both saddled. He simply looked at her, and she understood. She allowed him to help her mount, her body moving with the slow, clumsy motions of a sleepwalker. They rode to Silver Creek in silence. He did not try to comfort her. He simply rode beside her, a steady, solid presence against the tide of her grief, and it was the greatest comfort he could have offered. The burial was a bleak affair. The preacher said a few hollow words over a simple pine box. A handful of neighbors stood at a respectful distance, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. When it was over, Gabe led her to the small, damp room where her mother had spent her last days. It was already empty, her mother's few possessions having been sold to pay for the coffin. They stood in the empty room, the finality of it pressing in on them. "You are free, Clara," Gabe said quietly, his voice gentle. "The debt is gone. You do not have to come back to the ranch. You can go wherever you want." She looked at him. He was offering her an escape, a release. He was trying to do the right thing, to be a good man, but she thought of leaving, of going where, to do what. The world felt vast and terrifyingly empty without her mother in it. The ranch, for all its pain and humiliation, was the only home she had, and this man, this complicated, broken, violent, and gentle man, she was not ready to leave him. Her pride, which had been the source of so much of her pain, now became her anchor. She would not be a charity case, set adrift by his pity. "No," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. She lifted her chin, her eyes, though red-rimmed and full of sorrow, meeting his directly. "Freedom does not feel like freedom if I have to take it from pity." He stared at her, and something in his expression shifted. The last of the hardness, the last of the cold distance, seemed to melt away. He looked at her then, really looked at her, not as the girl whose debt he had bought, not as a worker, not as a painful reminder of his own past. He saw Clara Duval, a woman forged in grief and hardship, a woman whose pride was as fierce and unyielding as his own, a woman who had just refused freedom in favor of a strange, unspoken bond between them. And in that long, silent look, something new and profound and utterly terrifying began to change in both of them. Clara's decision to stay changed the seasons at the Callahan Ranch, as autumn bled its colors into the gray and white of winter. A slow thaw began, not in the frozen earth, but in the house itself. Her grief for her mother remained a quiet, constant ache, but it was a clean wound now, not a festering one. She had chosen this path, and with that choice came a strange and unexpected sense of purpose. She was no longer just a servant working off a debt. She was a part of the ranch's rhythm, its struggle against the harshness of the land. She threw herself into the work, her sorrow a fuel for her resolve. She asked Silas, the grizzled foreman, to teach her how to mend the fences that had for so long looked like symbols of decay. She learned to read the sky for signs of a coming storm, to spot a cow favoring a sore hoof from 100 yards away. The ranch hands, who had once looked at her with either pity or contempt, began to watch her with a new, grudging respect. She did not complain. She did not shirk the hardest tasks, and she had a quiet way with the animals that none of them could deny. Her moment of true acceptance came during the first blizzard of the season. It swept down from the mountains with a sudden, shocking fury, a wall of white that erased the world. The men scrambled to get the herds into the sheltered valleys. In the chaos, a young heifer, having just given birth, returned to the barn alone. The calf was missing. "It is a goner," Silas said grimly, shaking the snow from his hat as he stood in the barn doorway. "Cannot send a man out in this. He will be lost in 5 minutes. We will lose the man and the calf." Gabe stood nearby, his face a mask of frustration, the welfare of his livestock warring with the safety of his men. But Clara remembered. She had seen that particular heifer that morning, near the old cottonwood that stood in a shallow ravine. While the men debated, she pulled on a heavy coat of Gabe's that she had found in a closet, wrapped a scarf around her face, and slipped out the back of the barn unnoticed. The wind was a physical force, shoving her, screaming in her ears. The snow was so thick she could barely see her own feet, but she kept the vague shape of the ravine in her mind and pushed forward, calling for the calf, her voice stolen by the storm. She found it, half buried in a snowdrift at the base of the cottonwood. A small, shivering creature, its cries weak. It was too heavy for her to carry. With a strength born of desperation, she managed to heave and push the calf onto its feet, shielding it with her own body against the wind, and began the slow, torturous process of herding it back toward the barn. When she finally stumbled through the barn door, covered in snow, her face raw with cold, pushing the calf before her, the men fell silent. Silas stared, his mouth agape. Gabe moved toward her, his eyes blazing with a mixture of fury and awe. "That was the act of a fool," he said, his voice rough as he pulled the scarf from her frozen face. "The calf is alive," she replied, her teeth chattering. He looked from her to the small, shivering animal, and for the first time since she had met him, a genuine, unguarded smile touched Gabe Callahan's lips. It was a small, fleeting thing, but it transformed his harsh face, revealing a glimpse of the man he might have been. The respect of the cowhands was one thing, but that small, rare smile from Gabe was a greater reward than she could have imagined. From that day on, he began to seek out her company. He started inviting her to take her supper with him, not at the long, formal dining table, but on a tray by the fire in his office. The first few times were awkward, the silence punctuated by the crackle of the flames and the clink of silverware. They spoke of the ranch, of the price of cattle, of the need for a new well. But slowly, the conversations deepened. He asked her about her father, and she spoke of his kindness and his dreams. She asked him about his own early days, and he told her stories of being a young, penniless cowboy, of sleeping under the stars and fighting for every scrap he owned. They spoke of their pasts, two lonely cartographers mapping out the safe, shallow edges of their grief, never daring to venture toward the deep, painful centers, but finding comfort in the shared geography of loss. One evening, as a bitter wind rattled the window panes, Clara was chopping vegetables for a stew. She was tired, her mind wandering back to a story Gabe had told her the night before. The knife slipped on a hard winter carrot, and she cried out as a sharp, searing pain shot through her hand. Blood welled instantly, dripping onto the clean wooden cutting board. She pressed her apron to the wound, a wave of dizziness washing over her. Gabe, drawn by her cry, appeared in the kitchen doorway. "What is it?" he asked, his voice sharp with alarm. He saw the blood and was at her side in 2 long strides. "Let me see." He gently took her hand, his touch surprisingly careful. The cut was deep, a clean, open gash across the fleshy part of her palm. "This needs stitching," he said, his face grim. He led her to a chair and had her sit, then gathered supplies with a practiced efficiency. A bottle of carbolic, a clean needle and thread from Mrs. Avery's sewing kit, and strips of clean linen. He knelt before her and began to clean the wound. His touch was firm, but incredibly gentle. She hissed as the antiseptic stung, and his gray eyes flickered up to meet hers, full of a concern that made her heart ache. "Hold still," he murmured, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. He worked with a quiet, intense focus, his large, calloused hands surprisingly deft as he stitched the wound closed. His proximity was overwhelming. She could feel the warmth of his body, see the flecks of silver in his dark hair, smell the faint, clean scent of pine soap and leather that clung to him. Her own feelings, which she had tried so desperately to keep buried, rose up in a powerful, undeniable wave. When he was finished, he wrapped her hand in a clean linen bandage, his movements slow and hesitant, as if he were touching something precious and fragile. He held her hand in his for a moment longer than necessary, his thumb stroking the back of her wrist. "You have to be more careful," he said, his voice a low rumble. She could not speak, her throat tight with emotion. He looked around the warm, lamp-lit kitchen, at the bubbling stew pot, at her sitting in his chair, and a profound look of weary gratitude settled on his face. He looked back at her, his eyes holding hers. "This house was a tomb for 5 years," he said, his voice thick with unspoken pain. "Just a place of ghosts. You make this house feel alive again, Clara." His words were a confession, an admission that she was more than just a worker, more than a debt. She was a presence that was healing him. The intimacy of the moment, the raw vulnerability in his eyes, terrified her. She was falling in love with him, and it was an impossible, dangerous love. He was the wealthy rancher, a man of standing and power. She was the woman he had bought in a saloon, the subject of the town's cruelest gossip. There was a canyon between their classes, and the memory of the town's cruelty was a constant, chilling reminder of the consequences of crossing it. She pulled her hand from his grasp, stood up too quickly, and mumbled her thanks before retreating to the safety of her room, leaving him kneeling alone by the fire. Trouble, when it came, rode in on a fine-looking sorrel horse. Clayton Reeves was a man who wore his wealth like a suit of armor. His family had owned the neighboring ranch for generations, and he viewed Gabe as little more than a coarse upstart who had gotten lucky. There was a long-standing, bitter rivalry between them over land, water rights, and what Reeves saw as Gabe's improper ambition. Reeves arrived one afternoon on the pretense of discussing a strayed herd, but his eyes were constantly moving, assessing the state of Gabe's ranch, looking for any sign of weakness. Gabe, wary but civil, invited him into his office. While they spoke, Clara came out onto the porch to shake out a rug. Reeves saw her through the window, excusing himself. He stepped out onto the porch, a predatory smile on his handsome face. Well, he said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. "I had heard Callahan had acquired some new assets, but the rumors did not do you justice." He looked her up and down, his gaze insolent and proprietary. Clara's back stiffened. "I work for Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice cold. Reeves chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "Is that what he calls it? I must say, Callahan has a reputation for driving a hard bargain. Tell me, what is the going rate for a pretty thing like you? A man like Callahan does not pay $200 to clear a saloon debt just to have his floors scrubbed. He must be getting his money's worth in other ways. I am sure you have been working very hard to earn your keep." The insinuation was as vile as it was unmistakable. It was everything the town whispered, everything she feared. Given voice by this smug, cruel man, the same fury she had felt in the barn rose in her, hot and clean. Without a second of hesitation, she slapped him hard across the face, the crack of the blow echoing in the quiet afternoon air. Reeves's face contorted with rage. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like claws. "You little—" The office door flew open. Gabe stood there, his face a thundercloud, his eyes chips of ice. He had heard every word. "Get your hands off her, Reeves," he said, his voice lethally soft. Reeves released her, shoving her away. He turned to Gabe, his lip curled in a sneer. "Controlling your property. Callahan, she has a temper. You should train her better." "Get off my land," Gabe said, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Now." Reeves laughed, mounted his horse, and galloped away. But the poison of his words lingered in the air. Clara stood trembling, wrapping her arms around herself, the shame and humiliation washing over her anew. Gabe took a step toward her, his face a mixture of rage and concern, but she flinched away from him and ran into the house. Gabe watched her go, then turned his gaze to the cloud of dust that marked Reeves's departure. The rage in him was a white-hot fire. This was not like Harlow's pathetic gossip. This was a direct challenge from a rival, an attack on his home, an insult to the woman he did not let himself finish the thought. He strode to the stable, ignoring Silas's questioning look, and rode out. not in a blind fury, but with the cold, deadly purpose of a hunter. He found Reeves not far from the property line, near the old stables that marked the border between their ranches. The confrontation was immediate and violent. There were no more words. Gabe launched himself from his horse, pulling Reeves from his saddle. They crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs. It was not a fight of skill, but of raw, primal fury. They rolled in the dirt, their fists finding their marks with brutal efficiency. Reeves was a strong man, but Gabe was powered by a righteous rage that went beyond a simple rivalry. He was fighting for her honor, for the sanctity of his home, for the fragile peace she had brought into his life. He fought until Reeves lay bruised and bleeding in the dirt, unable to rise. Gabe stood over him, his chest heaving, his body a map of new pains. He had won, but not without cost. His lip was split, his eye was swelling shut, and a searing pain in his side told him at least one rib was broken. A deep, ragged gash on his forearm was bleeding freely. He ignored it. He climbed onto his horse and began the slow, painful ride home. He made it as far as his own stable yard before the world started to tilt. He slid from the saddle, his legs giving way beneath him, and collapsed against a fence post, a groan of pain escaping his lips. Clara found him there. She had been watching from the window, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs since he had ridden out. Seeing him now, battered and bleeding, a cry of fear escaped her. She ran to his side, Silas close behind her. "Help me get him inside," she commanded, her voice shaking but firm. Together, they half carried, half dragged him into the house and to his downstairs bedroom. She sent Silas for hot water and bandages, her mind working with a desperate clarity. She lit every lamp in the room, her hands trembling as she began the work of tending to him. She gently cut away the sleeve of his shirt, her stomach lurching at the sight of the deep, dirty gash on his arm. His ribs were already turning a dark, ugly purple. She worked through the night, a long, silent vigil in the lamp-lit room. She cleaned and stitched his arm, her movements mimicking the ones he had used on her own hand just weeks before. She washed the blood and dirt from his face, her touch as light as a moth's wing. She wrapped his ribs tightly, her hands moving with a desperate, loving care. He drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering her name once in a pained whisper. As the first pale light of dawn crept into the room, he woke, his good eye focused on her, sitting in a chair beside his bed, her face pale with exhaustion, her dress stained with his blood. "Clara," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You are a fool, Gabe Callahan," she said softly, her eyes filling with tears. He reached out his uninjured hand, and she took it, her fingers lacing with his. He held on as if she were a lifeline. "I am sorry," he rasped. "I am sorry for all of it. For that day in the saloon. For bringing you here this way." He took a painful breath. "I never meant to own you. Clara, I saw you that day, standing up to Harlow, so proud and fierce, even when you had nothing. You reminded me of something pure I thought I had lost forever in this world. I did not know how to save you. I only knew how to buy you." His confession was a key, unlocking the last bolted door in her heart. All the resentment, all the anger she had held on to, dissolved in the face of his raw, painful honesty. He had not seen her as property. He had seen her as a kindred spirit, another survivor. Tears streamed down her face as she leaned over him. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows of the quiet, wounded house. He lifted his hand from hers and gently cupped her cheek, just as he had in the barn. This time, she did not pull away. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. Their first kiss was not born of passion, but of a desperate, profound relief. It was hesitant, clumsy, a question and an answer all at once. It was the taste of salt from her tears and iron from his split lip. It was two broken souls finding the missing pieces of themselves in the other. It was a promise made in the quiet of the dawn, a fragile shelter against the howling wind. Eventually, utterly spent, she sank back into the chair, her hand still holding his. Her eyelids grew heavy, and she finally succumbed to an exhausted sleep. Gabe lay there, the pain in his body a dull throb compared to the fierce, terrifying joy in his heart. He watched her sleep in the growing light, her face soft and peaceful. He knew the world would not understand. He knew the town would judge them, that men like Reeves would try to destroy them. But in that moment, none of it mattered. He had found something true in the ruins of his life. He tightened his grip on her hand and whispered to the sleeping woman who had made his house a home again. "If there is sin in loving you," he murmured, his voice a raw, reverent vow, "I will answer for it in the next life." The days following Gabe's recovery were a fragile, stolen peace. A new tenderness existed between them, lived in quiet, shared glances across the supper table, in the way his hand would briefly rest on her back as they walked from the stables. A silent, possessive, and yet gentle gesture. They existed in a bubble, a world that contained only the sprawling land of the ranch and the four walls of the house she was slowly bringing back to life. But the world outside had not forgotten them, and the bubble was about to burst. News of Gabe's savage beating of Clayton Reeves spread through Silver Creek with the speed of a prairie fire. The story, twisted and embellished with every telling, became the town's most delicious scandal. It was no longer a story about a debt or a lonely rancher. It was a lurid tale of passion and jealousy. Gabe Callahan, the cold, reclusive widower, was now seen as a man bewitched, driven to violence by a scheming, immoral woman. And Clara Duval, once the subject of pity, was now the object of outright scorn. The condemnation found its voice in the pulpit. The following Sunday, Reverend Miller, a man whose piety was matched only by his lack of compassion, delivered a sermon that set the town buzzing. He did not mention Clara by name, but no one in the crowded pews had any doubt who he was speaking of when he thundered against the Scarlet Woman and the Jezebel who leads good men to ruin. He spoke of sin taking root in their very own community, of a fallen woman whose disgrace was a stain upon them all. Clara, who had not attended, heard about it from Silas, whose wife reported the sermon with a mixture of grim satisfaction and pity. The words were a public branding, an official declaration of her damnation in the eyes of the town. The consequences were swift and tangible. A few days later, a cattle buyer from Cheyenne, a man with whom Gabe had done business for years, rode out to the ranch after a tense, brief meeting in Gabe's office. The man left. The major cattle deal they had been negotiating suddenly canceled. He said he could not do business with a man whose personal affairs are a source of public scandal. Gabe told Clara that evening, his voice tight with a frustration that went deeper than lost profits. It was an attack on his name, on the empire he had built from dust and sweat. His world, which had once seemed as vast as his land, was shrinking, the walls of the town's judgment closing in around them. The most painful blow, however, came from within the house itself. Mrs. Avery, who had watched the growing intimacy between Gabe and Clara with a face like thunder, finally confronted him. She found him on the porch, staring out at the setting sun, and announced she was leaving. "I have worked in this house for 10 years, Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice stiff with a cold, formal anger. "I served your wife, Elizabeth, a true lady. I kept this house as a monument to her memory." She paused, her gaze flicking with open disgust toward the kitchen, where Clara was working. "I cannot, in good conscience, continue to serve in a place that has become this, to see how far the ranch has fallen, to see her memory disrespected in this way. It is more than I can bear." Her words were a dagger to Gabe's heart, aimed at the oldest and deepest of his wounds. The implication was clear. Clara's presence was a betrayal of the sainted Elizabeth. "That is enough, Martha," Gabe said, his voice dangerously quiet. It is my duty to say it. She pressed on, relentless. You have brought shame upon this house. She was gone by morning, her departure leaving an echoing silence in her wake. Her judgment, more than the town's gossip or the lost business deal, was what made their isolation complete. They were truly alone now, two outcasts in a fortress of their own making. That night, as they sat by the fire, the weight of the world pressing in on them, Gabe turned to Clara, his face etched with a desperate resolve. "Marry me," he said. It was not a question, but a command, a solution. Clara stared at him, her heart sinking. "What? Marry me?" he repeated, his voice firm. "We will ride to the next county. It will be legal and binding. It will give you my name. It will silence them. It will protect you." He was offering her his name as a shield, his ring as a fortress against the town's cruelty. He was trying to fix this the only way he knew how, with a formal, binding contract. And it was this, the practicality of his offer, that broke her heart. "Is that why you are asking me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "To protect me, to silence the gossip?" "It is the only way," he insisted, his frustration growing. "Your name will be respectable. You will be Mrs. Callahan." She stood up, her whole body trembling with a sorrowful resolve. She looked at this man she had grown to love, this broken, powerful man who still did not understand. "No," she said softly. His face hardened with disbelief. "No? After everything? Do you prefer being the town scandal?" "I prefer the truth," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I will not marry you to pay off a debt of guilt you feel you owe me. I will not marry you to become a respectable woman in the eyes of people who despise me. I will not be a solution to a problem." "Gabe." She took a step closer, her eyes pleading with him to understand. "I will marry you for one reason and one reason only, and you have not said it." She waited, her heart aching for him to say the words, to offer not just his name, but his heart. But he remained silent, his pride and his old wounds a wall between them. He did not know how. "Not because of debt," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Not because of guilt. Only if it is love." Without waiting for a reply she knew would not come, she turned and fled to her room, leaving him staring into the fire, the chasm between what he felt and what he could say wider than ever. Clara knew she could not hide forever. The town's judgment was a festering wound, and her pride demanded that she face it, not cower from it. The following Sunday, she did something that took every ounce of her courage. She dressed in her best, plain dress, saddled Daisy, and rode into Silver Creek. She rode directly to the church. When she walked through the doors, a wave of silence washed over the congregation. Whispers ceased, heads turned. The air grew thick with a collective, hostile curiosity. Clara ignored them. With her head held high, she walked down the aisle and took a seat in an empty pew near the front. Throughout Reverend Miller's sermon on the virtues of humility and repentance, she could feel hundreds of eyes on her back. She did not flinch. After the final hymn, as people began to stand and file out, she remained seated. Then, when a lull fell over the shuffling crowd, she stood. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing through the silent church. Every eye turned back to her. Reverend Miller stopped in the aisle, his face a mask of stern disapproval. "I have heard," Clara began, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the people who had judged her without knowing her, "that there has been much talk of sin in this town, and much of it has been directed at me." A murmur went through the crowd. "You speak of me as a fallen woman. You whisper about my life, and you pass your judgment as if you were God himself." She took a step into the aisle, her eyes finding the Reverend's. "The Bible you preach from speaks of many things. You talk of sin, but not of mercy. You talk of judgment, but not of forgiveness. You look at me and see a sinner, but which one of you is without sin?" Which one of you has a heart so pure that you can afford to cast stones at another?" The crowd was utterly silent now, their self-righteous certainty shaken by her direct, fearless challenge. "I am not here to ask for your acceptance," she finished, her voice ringing with a strength she did not know she possessed. "I am here to tell you that my soul is a matter between myself and my Maker, not a subject for town gossip. Perhaps you should spend less time worrying about the splinter in my eye and more time worrying about the beam in your own." She turned then and walked, not ran, out of the church, her back straight, her dignity intact. She left behind a congregation stunned into silence, the force of her quiet courage more powerful than any sermon. Her victory was short-lived. That night, tragedy struck. It came in the form of a smell, acrid smoke on the cold night air, and then a sound, the terrified, high-pitched screaming of horses. Clara was the first one awake. She looked out her window and saw a horrifying orange glow lighting up the darkness. The main barn was on fire. She screamed Gabe's name as she ran down the stairs and out into the yard. The barn was already an inferno, flames licking up the dry timber walls and roaring through the hayloft. Ranch hands were running from the bunkhouse, shouting, forming a futile bucket brigade from the well. Gabe was already there, his face illuminated by the hellish light, a look of utter devastation in his eyes. The barn was the heart of his ranch, the symbol of his life's work. "The horses!" he yelled over the roar of the fire. "We have to get the horses out!" His prize stallion and several other valuable horses were trapped in their stalls, their panicked whinnies a sound of pure terror. Ignoring Silas's shouts to stay back, Gabe soaked a blanket in the water trough and ran toward the main barn doors. He disappeared into the swirling smoke and fire. Clara's heart stopped. She watched the doorway, praying, one by one. Terrified horses began to bolt from the inferno, their eyes wide with fear. Gabe had managed to open their stalls, but he did not come out. "Gabe!" she screamed. Just then, a great cracking sound echoed from within the barn, followed by a shower of sparks. A main support beam had given way, without a second of hesitation. Clara grabbed another wet blanket and ran into the fire after him. The heat was a physical blow, stealing her breath. Smoke burned her eyes and lungs. She found him near the back, pinned to the ground by a heavy, smoldering beam that had fallen across his legs. He was conscious, but dazed, trying to push it off with no success. "Clara, get out!" he choked, his voice hoarse. "The roof is going!" "Not without you!" she screamed back, adrenaline coursing through her. She wedged her shoulder under the heavy timber, her feet slipping in the chaos on the floor. She pushed with a strength she did not know she possessed, a raw, primal force born of love and terror. The beam shifted, just enough. She grabbed Gabe under the arms and dragged him, his body a dead weight, toward the door. They collapsed out into the yard just as the main roof of the barn gave way with a deafening roar, sending a column of flame and embers soaring into the night sky. They lay on the ground, gasping for air, their faces black with soot, and watched the barn burn. They watched years of hard work, of dreams and sweat, turn to ash. The fire burned until dawn, leaving a black, smoking skeleton against the pale morning light. Gabe stood, his body aching, his spirit broken, and surveyed the ruin. The smell of wet, charred wood was the smell of utter defeat. Clayton Reeves had done this. He knew it as surely as he knew his own name, but the cause did not matter as much as the effect. He was ruined, and he had brought her down with him. He looked at Clara, at her soot-stained face and the singed ends of her hair, at the fierce, loyal love in her eyes, and a wave of self-loathing washed over him. He had taken her from one kind of poverty only to drag her into another. "You have to leave, Clara," he said, his voice a dead, hollow thing. She stared at him, her expression crumbling from exhaustion to disbelief. "What are you talking about? We will rebuild, together." "There is nothing to rebuild," he said, his voice flat, his eyes avoiding hers. "I am finished. Look at this. I have nothing left to offer you but a pile of ashes and a lifetime of struggle. You deserve better than that. You deserve a good life, a husband who can provide for you, a place where people respect you." "I do not care about any of that," she cried, grabbing his arm. "I care about you." He pulled his arm away, his face a mask of cold, hard grief. "I am doing this for you," he said. "I am setting you free. I should have done it a long time ago. Go find a life for yourself, away from all this ruin, away from me." He was pushing her away, trying to be noble, trying to save her from himself, but it felt like the cruelest form of rejection. Tears streamed down her face, carving clean paths through the soot. He would not look at her. His decision was made, a final, unbreakable act of a man consumed by his own guilt. There was nothing more to say. She turned, her heart shattering into a million pieces. She walked to the stable, the small, secondary one that had been spared, and saddled Daisy. She did not pack a bag. She had nothing to take with her but a broken heart. As she rode away from the ranch, the same dry wind that had greeted her on her first day blew dust through her hair, a bitter, final farewell. For 2 days, Gabe walked through the ruins of his life in a daze of grief and despair. His men worked to clean the wreckage, their faces grim, but he barely noticed them. The light had gone out of him again, leaving a darkness deeper than before, because this time he knew the warmth he was missing. On the 3rd day, he forced himself to enter the silent, empty house. He walked into her room. It was neat and impersonal, as if she had never been there, except for one thing. On the small nightstand, beside the bed she had left unmade, was her father's worn book of poems. Tucked inside the cover was a folded piece of paper. His name was written on it in her neat, careful hand. With trembling fingers, he unfolded it. The letter was short. "Gabe, you think you took me for a debt, a price paid in a saloon. You are wrong. You did not take me for a debt. You took me from despair. You gave me a home when I had none, and a purpose when I was lost. That is a gift worth more than any freedom you could offer me. Do not let this break you. The sun will feel warm again. Clara." He read the words once, then twice. "You took me from despair." He had been so focused on what he had taken from her that he had never truly understood what he had given her. He had seen himself as her jailer, while she had seen him as her savior. He had pushed her away to save her from ruin, but all he had done was create a ruin inside himself. A great, shuddering sob broke from his chest. He sank onto her bed, the letter clutched in his hand, and wept. He wept for his lost wife, for his burned-down barn. But most of all, he wept for the fool he had been, for letting the strongest, bravest woman he had ever known ride away from him. The despair did not last. It was burned away by a sudden, fierce clarity. He was not ruined. A man was only ruined when he lost the one thing that mattered. He stood up, his face set with a desperate, new resolve. He was a man who had built an empire from nothing. He could do it again, but not without her. He strode from the house, ignoring the pain in his ribs, and saddled his stallion. He did not know where she had gone, but he knew he would search every dusty town, every lonely homestead, every inch of this unforgiving land until he found her. He spurred his horse into a gallop, his heart breaking with every mile that separated them. A man finally riding not for land, or for pride, but for love. Clara rode until the familiar landscape of the Callahan Ranch was nothing but a memory, swallowed by the vast, indifferent plains. She did not have a destination in mind, only a direction, a way. But as the miles passed and the initial, fiery pain of Gabe's rejection cooled to a deep, chilling ache, she found herself drifting toward the one place left in the world that held any piece of her past. It was a place of ghosts and memories, a place she had not seen in years, her father's old cabin. It stood in a forgotten corner of the territory, nestled in a grove of cottonwoods by a bend in the river. The homestead had been sold off long ago, But the cabin itself, deemed worthless, had been left to the mercy of the seasons. It was a ruin, the roof sagging, the single window boarded up, but it was hers. She spent the first few days in a fever of work, patching the roof with scavenged timber and mud, clearing out the nests of pack rats, and sweeping away years of dust and decay. Work was a balm, a way to keep the crushing weight of her loneliness at bay. As the days shortened and winter tightened its grip on the land, a profound solitude settled over her. The river froze along its banks, and the cottonwood trees stood like stark, bony skeletons against a perpetual gray sky. Her only companions were the cry of a lone hawk and the whisper of the wind through the dry branches. Grief was a constant presence, a cold shadow that sat with her by her small, smoky fire. She grieved for her mother, for her father, and with a pain so sharp it felt like a physical wound. She grieved for Gabe. She had found a home in the heart of that broken man, and he had cast her out. Gabe searched for her with the desperation of a man who had already lost everything once and could not bear to lose it again. He rode for days, his body aching, his face gaunt with lack of sleep and food. He questioned weary travelers, stern-faced sheriffs, and tight-lipped homesteaders in every dusty settlement for 100 miles. No one had seen a lone woman on a gentle mare. He was chasing a ghost. His hope was nearly gone when he remembered a story she had told him one night by the fire. A story about her father building a small cabin by a river, a place where the fishing was good and the trees blocked the harsh summer sun. It was a sliver of a chance, a wild guess, but it was all he had left. He turned his horse toward the river, his heart a frantic, unsteady drum against his bruised ribs. He found the cabin at dawn. A thin, hopeful plume of smoke rose from the crumbling stone chimney, a beacon in the cold. Gray light. He dismounted, his legs unsteady, his coat torn from riding through thick brush. He looked like a man who had wrestled with demons and barely won. He approached the cabin slowly, his heart in his throat. What if she turned him away? After what he had done, he knew he deserved it. She was outside, splitting firewood with a determined, steady rhythm, her breath pluming in the frigid air. She was thinner, her face etched with a new, harder kind of solitude, but she had never looked stronger. She stopped, the axe held loosely in her hand. When she saw him, her face, which he had dreamed of every night, was a mask of shock, pain, and a pride that had been honed to a razor's edge. He took a step toward her, his voice a hoarse, broken thing. "Clara!" "Why are you here, Gabe?" she asked, her voice flat, devoid of the warmth he remembered. "I was a fool," he said, his words raw with a truth he had nearly learned too late. "I was a damned fool. I read your letter. I came to bring you home." Home? The word was brittle, sharp. She looked at him, her eyes clear and unyielding. "I will not go back to that. I will not be the town's shame. I will not live in the shadow of your guilt, waiting for the next disaster to strike so you can throw me out to save me. I will not live my life as a scandal you are trying to manage." She lifted her chin, her voice gaining a quiet, unshakable strength. "I will not go back if it means living under shame." It was not an argument. It was a declaration. She was choosing a life of lonely hardship and dignity over a life of comfort and disgrace. She was choosing herself. And in that moment, he knew that all his power, all his wealth, all his commands meant nothing. The only thing that mattered was the heart of the woman standing before him, a heart he had shattered. He saw the truth of it then. He could not command her to return. He could not buy her forgiveness. He could not fix this with his fists or his money. He could only surrender. He took another step forward and sank to his knees before her in the cold, damp mud of the riverbank. He, Gabe Callahan, who had never knelt for any man, knelt for her. He looked up at her, his hollow eyes filled with a desperate, soul-deep plea. "Then I will stay here," he said. his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I will build you a new roof. I will hunt for our food. I will live in this ruin with you for the rest of my days, if that is what it takes." A tear he did not know he had left to cry traced a path through the grime on his cheek. "I will stay here until you believe that I am not asking you to be mine. I am begging to belong to you." His words were a demolition, tearing down the last of her defenses, the last of her pride. A sob broke from her chest, a ragged, wounded sound. The axe fell from her hand. This was not the man who had bought her, or the man who had hidden her away, or the man who had pushed her away. This was a man stripped bare of everything but his love for her, offering her not possession, but his very soul. "I love you," she cried, the words she had held back for so long finally breaking free. "I love you, but I am so afraid. I am afraid of losing myself again. I am afraid of becoming nothing more than Callahan's woman, a story people tell, instead of the person I am meant to be." He reached out and took her hand, his touch reverent. He rose from his knees and pulled her gently toward him, framing her face with his hands. He looked into her eyes, and in their depths, she saw a promise that was more binding than any ring, more sacred than any vow. "Listen to me, Clara Duval," he said, his voice soft but filled with an unshakable conviction. "You never belonged to anyone. Not to your father, not to Harlow, not to this town." He paused, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. "Not even me. You have always belonged to yourself. I am just asking. I am asking if you will let me belong to you, too." And with that, the last of her fear washed away on a tide of tears. She leaned into him, her arms wrapping around his neck, and kissed him, a kiss of forgiveness, of homecoming, of a love that had been tested by fire and shame and had emerged stronger than steel. They returned to the ranch together, not as master and servant, but as partners. The ride was not silent and tense, but filled with quiet conversation, with shared glances that held a world of understanding. When they crested the hill and saw the ranch spread out below them, the blackened, skeletal remains of the barn a stark wound on the landscape, Clara did not see ruin. She saw a place to begin again. The rebuilding was slow and arduous. Gabe, with Clara at his side, drew up the plans for a new barn, one stronger and better than the last. He worked alongside his men, his hands, softened by years of being the master, growing calloused once more. Clara worked with him, hauling timber, fetching tools, offering suggestions that were born of a farmer's daughter's common sense. Silas and the other hands watched them, and the last of their skepticism melted away. They saw a man and a woman rebuilding a life from ashes, side by side, their love a quiet, steady force against the world. The cruelty of the town lingered. There were still cold shoulders in the general store, still whispers that died when they approached. But something had changed. Gabe and Clara no longer hid. They rode into town together, their heads held high, meeting the stairs with a quiet dignity that was impossible to mock. They were not ashamed, and their lack of shame slowly began to rob the gossip of its power. Over the years, the story of their scandalous beginning began to change. It softened, evolving from a tale of sin into a quiet legend, the story of the woman who was taken for a debt, and the wealthy rancher who repaid it with his heart. They became a part of the landscape, as rugged and enduring as the land itself. Years passed, the harsh seasons turned, each one leaving the ranch stronger, more prosperous. The scars on the land faded, replaced by new life. One late summer evening, years later, Clara stood on the porch of the house that was now truly her home. The air was warm, smelling of hay and dust and the coming twilight. A small boy with his father's dark hair and her stubborn chin ran laughing across the yard, chasing a stray chicken. Her son, their son. Her gaze shifted to the far pasture, where Gabe was mending a section of fence, his broad shoulders outlined against the setting sun. The light was a brilliant, burning gold, wrapping him in a halo of warmth and peace. He looked up, as if he could feel her watching him, and smiled. It was the easy, open smile he now wore so often, a smile that reached all the way to his clear, gray eyes. A gentle breeze rose, the same wind that had once carried only dust and despair. Now, it felt like a caress. Clara smiled back at her husband, a lifetime of love and hardship and contentment passing between them in that single, silent look. She whispered the words to the wind, a final, quiet truth that had been the heart of her story all along. "You never really took me," she said softly. "I came—" The wind rose again, carrying the scent of the dry earth and the warmth of the dying sun across the plains, a sign that love, though born in pain, had finally and forever found its home. Thank you for listening to our story. Comment where you are listening from so you can connect with others. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.